Sharm el-Sheikh is a city found on the tip of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and is a popular destination for tourists due to its sandy beaches and luxurious resorts. With a rich and diverse marine habitat, many people come just for the swimming, as they can watch the fish swim amongst the colorful coral reefs. What most people don't know about this resort city is that it was terrorized by sharks in 2010. This spate of attacks began with two women, 48-year-old Olga Martchenko and 70-year-old Lyudmila Stolyarova, both on holiday from Russia. Although at the time they only had their nationality in common and didn't know each other, they would end the day in the same helicopter, being airlifted to an intensive care hospital to treat the injuries that they inflicted within minutes of each other. First, let's take a look at Olga Martchenko and the events just before her attack. She had taken a holiday to Egypt with her daughter, Yelena, in November 2010 and had been enjoying showing her the culture of the new country, as well as taking advantage of the beautiful coastal scenery that was on offer to them. They both loved swimming together, and so most of the holiday had been taken up in the crystal waters of the Red Sea. On the day of the attack, the mother and daughter had decided to have one last swim before choosing somewhere to eat, but they would never make it to their lunch date. Olga was floating on her back, staring up at the clear sky above her and feeling the warm water on her skin. It felt like paradise. Her left arm was stretched out wide, and after some time floating, it grazed against something rough like sandpaper. At first, she suspected it was a rock, but it felt too leathery to be a rock. So she tried to figure out exactly what she was touching. Maybe it was a dolphin. She didn't have to wonder for long, as she felt a shark dig its jagged teeth into her arm and shake her. Pain ripped through her arm, and when she tore away from the jaws of the massive animal, she quickly saw that it had ripped her arm clean off. Terrified and covered in her own blood, she began to scream for help, frantically searching for her daughter and praying the shark wasn't about to bite her now too. Luckily, Yelena was safe on the jetty and had seen the ordeal, watching her mother sink beneath the waves and then arise in a panic, red with blood. As Olga tried to swim back to the jetty, the shark continued to follow her, biting her again and again. Each bite forced her back under the water, and the whole beach could hear her screams as she resurfaced. Luckily for her, Olga was wearing swim fins at the time, which helped to propel her to the jetty and into the open arms of the lifeguards, who quickly pulled her from the water. Onlookers watched as the shark continued to circle, just as Olga had been dragged from the water. It was now a race against time to keep her alive long enough for her to get the medical help she desperately needed before she bled out.
Are any of the fingers completely amputated?
It looks like her entire hand is gone.
Okay, if you can, just make sure they take a clean, dry cloth and wrap it around the wound and place pressure on it.
On the other side of the beach, Lyudmila was relaxing with her husband Vladimir in the sand. As it was coming to the end of their holiday, she was trying to make the most of the hot sun and warm waters before she had to go back to her cold hometown in Russia. She suggested to her husband that they should go swimming. He was deeply engrossed in his book, so declined, but encouraged her to go swimming by herself before they headed home. She agreed and disappeared into the water. At the same time, a dive instructor called Hassan Ali was on the sea floor with a client, showing her the basics of diving and introducing them to a new underwater world. Nearing the end of the dive, Hassan watched as a 3-meter white-tipped shark approached him and his client. Concerned by its nervous movements, he decided to make himself look as large as possible, and they both attempted to kick away the animal as it circled them, seemingly looking for a safe route of attack. When it realized that it was getting nowhere with the divers, it suddenly shot up to the surface as it grasped another meal, Lyudmila. Hassan watched in horror as the shark grabbed the elderly woman by the leg and pulled her beneath the surface. He was helpless to do anything but watch. The animal made quick work of her leg, tearing at it with a ferocity that Hassan had only seen on TV. Within seconds, it had torn her foot from her body. He struggled to see anything further as Ludmila's blood filled the ocean around her in a red cloud. Worrying for his client, he quickly brought her to the surface and handed her off to a colleague before diving back in to help the woman he had just witnessed being torn apart by a shark. He began to shout to everyone on the beach to get out of the water and that there was a shark attacking swimmers, but everyone already knew. They had already seen Olga getting attacked just 10 minutes earlier. As the lifeguards pulled Olga onto the jetty, they suddenly heard the screams of another woman, and upon looking towards the source, they could see an elderly woman covered in blood. They realized that the shark that had attacked Olga was not finished, and immediately began to evacuate the beach. With the help of Hassan, they were able to pull Ludmila from the water and lay her next to Olga as they attempted to slow the bleeding of both victims. Within a few minutes, they were picked up by ambulances and taken to the nearest hospital, but their ordeal was far from over. The paramedics struggled to keep both women alive as they fought to stop the extreme blood loss and shock from killing them both. Olga went into cardiac arrest during her transportation, but was miraculously resuscitated before she reached the hospital. In the operating room, the medical staff were finally able to see how severe Olga's injuries really were. The shark had removed most of her hand below the elbow, forcing surgeons to partially amputate what was left of her limb. Aside from her missing hand, she had a giant chunk taken out of her buttocks, so much so that a section of her spinal cord was visible. She was lucky not to lose her legs. She was given 6 units of blood to replace all that she lost in the water before being sent to intensive care for monitoring. Ludmila was also rushed into the operating room where she was assessed to see how they could save her life. Her left foot had to be amputated from where the shark had initially grabbed her, ripping her foot from her body. As she had tried to fight off the shark, it had grabbed her by her right arm, and out of instinct she had pulled her arm from its mouth. This action tore her skin from her arm, leaving the bone fully exposed before the animal severed her hand entirely. Her wounds were cleaned and closed as best that they could, administering her with 2 units of blood. The women remained in hospital in Cairo for 2 months before being airlifted together to Sheremetyevo International Airport near Moscow until they were able to be released back home. Their recoveries were long and arduous, with Olga's wounds even becoming septic once she arrived back in Russia. But eventually both women were able to make a full recovery, their bodies covered in scars. The shark responsible for the attacks was photographed by the client diving with Hassan Ali and had a distinctive notch from its fin, leading to an investigation as officials tried to locate the aggressive shark. It was soon identified as the perpetrator of the next 3 attacks, the last one killing an elderly German tourist. The shark was never caught, but was spotted by diver operators a few months later. Shockingly, videos were taken of a dive master hand-feeding this shark, a practice that has now been banned. It is thought that the hand-feeding of sharks contributed to the attacks that week as they became less frightened of humans and thought of them as a source of food. This might explain why the shark had bitten both women on the arm, possibly expecting it to be holding food. The divers would carry the food in a pack above their buttocks, which gives an indication as to why Olga's buttocks might have been bitten that day. This story was one of the worst shark attack sprees in modern history and brought a fear of the ocean to the locals for years to come, fearing that if they entered the waters, they would be next to be attacked and possibly meet their terrifying final affliction. John Richardson and Linda Moore had been dating for the past 4 years. They had gotten married the moment they met. Both Linda and John knew after the very first date that they were meant to be together and knew they would be together forever. But Linda was studying at UCLA, a big deal for a woman in 1971, and she was determined to get her doctoral degree before she took any time off for wedding planning, honeymoons, and all of that. John didn't mind, though. He'd waited his 31 years on this earth for a woman like Linda, so what was a few more years anyway? She was his, and he was hers. A court document with their names on it didn't change that fact in the slightest. Besides, it was Linda's brains and her ambition that made him fall in love with her. The 70s wasn't exactly a progressive time, so the two couldn't live together without being married, or both their very religious families would be mortified at their indiscretions. So they settled for taking as many weekends away together as they could, mostly going camping, since they enjoyed the great outdoors a lot. Getting away from the busy life of university with a short trip to nature was always something they looked forward to each week. They always took a friend or two, sometimes one of their parents, but most of the time they took John's half-brother, George Waddell, his wife, and their 3 kids. John liked to teach his godchildren to fish, and Linda ran and played with them in the streams. George and his wife didn't mind the attention at all. The young couple obviously enjoyed the children, and he and his wife could finally take a breather between child-rearing and work schedules. On the weekend of July the 26th, the group of them headed off toward Grand Lake, Colorado, looking forward to 4 days of fun and nature at Holsworth Ranch, just a little ways away from the Rocky National Park. Linda and John only had a single-man tent each, so they set them up next to each other, and George had bought his camper van to accommodate his family of 5. In 2 weeks' time, Linda and John would be married, and they wouldn't have to sleep separately anymore, something that they were both looking forward to. They set up camp while Linda took the kids to explore, and when they got back to the tents, they were erected and the fishing poles were already out. George's oldest son, 10-year-old George Jr., was the lucky one that day. The boy caught enough fish for the entire family, so they fried them up in a pan over the open fire for dinner. The cooler with chops and hot dogs stood forgotten in the camper, with so much fresh fish right there in front of them. The children began to doze off next to the fireside as the grown-ups had a drink or two and chatted into the evening. When the littlest one began to snore, the adults bid everyone good night. Tomorrow was going to be a long day of hiking and more exploring. Everyone needed to have enough sleep for it. John kissed Linda goodnight, and they each retreated to their own tents, while the Waddell family settled in their camper. But they'd left all of their plates, the pan, and the potato chip bag where they'd sat down for dinner, with plans to clean up the next morning before breakfast. And you probably know where this is going by now. All that food and the strong smell of cooked fish wafted into the forest, attracting every critter in the vicinity. Soon, a few field mice and even a raccoon got a taste of the scraps. As the night wore on and the little critters had their fill, another, bigger omnivore was making its way toward the scent. It took the 200-pound black bear all night to trek through the brush and to reach the camp just as the sun broke over the horizon. Everyone was still fast asleep, except for John. He sleepily stumbled out of his tent with the intention of emptying his bladder behind a crop of trees before heading back to bed to catch some more sleep. He walked down the very path that the hairy creature was approaching from, just 8 yards away from his tent flap. It's hard to say who was the most shocked. John, in his half-asleep state walking into a colossal fully grown bear, or the animal who wasn't expecting to run into a human. But the reaction from both was instantaneous. The animal roared with shock and anger, pulling itself up to its hind legs, extending its full height. John turned and ran, but with his pants half undone, he barely made it a yard before his loose clothes tangled around his legs and he went sprawling into the forest floor. Before John had the chance to yell out to his fiancée and his friends, the animal was already on top of his back, clamping its teeth into the back of his head, neck, and back. Linda, who was closest to the scene, woke up in a panic and headed out before she even understood what she was hearing. To her horror, she stumbled into the worst event she'd ever witnessed in her life. John was in the bear's mouth, being lifted into the air by the back of his shirt, and blood was spewing everywhere, turning the animal's fur dark red. The fabric of his shirt ripped clean out of the bear's teeth, and he fell to the ground. Linda launched herself at them, screaming a primal cry as she went. She threw herself over the fiancé's lifeless body, shielding him from the raging bear. The beast grabbed her by the back, using both its teeth and its claws. They went through her nightshirt like they weren't even there, raking grooves an inch deep into her skin as they went. It lifted her off John and threw her aside to get back at its initial target. Linda was thrown several feet away, landing hard against the trunk of a tree, breaking 3 of her ribs. She was knocked out cold from the strike against the tree that expelled all of the air in her lungs. Suddenly, George came running at them, dressed only in his sleeping shorts. Like Linda, he hadn't stopped to consider the danger to himself. He spared only a second to yell for his wife to lock the door and arm herself before he set off to do what he had to do to save his baby brother and future sister-in-law. As he came at the bear, he passed the fireplace and grabbed the pan they'd left there the night before. Bits of fish and cold, clumpy oil flew through the air when he brandished it. The bear charged at George, swinging wildly. The pan clanged against the animal's paw just as it swiped at George, undoubtedly saving George's face from a severe mauling. The bear barely felt the pan strike it, but it did feel the fish bones and oil that went into its eyes. Clawing at its own face to get the fine shards of bone out of its eyes, it began to yowl in pain and run back into the forest from where it came. It passed Linda on its way out, where she was playing dead next to the tree. George headed toward John, while his wife, who'd locked their children in the camper van, went off to help Linda. Linda groaned in pain. The wounds on her back were seeping blood, but no longer flowing freely. She was alive, despite her broken ribs and the damage to her back. But John was another story altogether. Lying on his stomach, he wasn't moving, and George could see the horrendous damage done to the back of his neck even before he reached his brother. The back of John's neck had been torn out almost completely. His vertebrae were poking through the shreds of flesh, and George could see blood pouring out in tune with his heart. Within seconds of reaching his body, the blood torrent stopped. There was no more left to spill, and his heart stopped beating before George could even turn him over. He loaded his dead brother into the camper while his wife wrapped Linda's wounds as best she could. Together, they carried her inside, too. It took them 20 minutes to reach the ranch owner, where they called in for help. The children never moved from the bed where they were huddled together in fear. Their uncle and aunt were both torn and broken, in full view on the camper floor. There was no way to spare them from the sight, not if they were going to get Linda to help on time. Thankfully, Linda's injuries, as severe as they were not very deep. Doctors worried that there had been damage to her spine, but miraculously there was no lasting damage. Her broken ribs posed the biggest threat, given that they were practically shattered, and they feared that bone would find its way into her lungs. But even with that danger, Linda made a full recovery and was out of the hospital within the week. They held John's funeral on what would have been their 1-week wedding anniversary, with Linda still in a wheelchair next to his gravesite when they lowered him into the ground. Unfortunately, no one could locate the bear. Professional hunters and sniffer dogs spent 2 weeks scouring the area, but it was gone just as quickly as it had come. There were more attacks in the years after Richard's death, and not all of those bears were identified either. So it's possible his killer went on to bring even more unsuspecting campers to their terrifying final affliction. Littered in the lakes and rivers of sub-Saharan Africa is the world's second heaviest land mammal, the hippopotamus. These enormous barrel-shaped animals are incapable of swimming, even though they spend most of their time in the water. Their powerful jaws are capable of crushing a crocodile or splitting a boat into 2. They don't take chances when it comes to defending their territory, which has led them to be the deadliest African animal. They are unpredictable in their attack, such that their victims rarely see them coming. When the COVID-19 pandemic came knocking, the usual routines of many people were broken. Lives were lost, and going to work or a simple trip to the grocery store without the risk of getting infected was almost impossible. Schools had to be closed to reduce the risk of infection, leaving many children stuck at home with nothing to do. In Uganda, Mugabe, a 16-year-old, was bored and tired of being locked in the house. He had read all the books he could get his hands on, did the chores, and helped his parents and siblings around the house. But he wanted something more fulfilling. As the businesses began to reopen, Mugabe packed his bags and bid his family goodbye. He was headed to his uncle's place in Karunda Maliga. Businesses were thriving here, and newbie business people had a better chance of scaling their businesses here. The competition was stiff, and only those resilient enough saw their business thrive. Mugabe was also going to try his luck here. He had always wanted to start a business of his own, and with schools closed indefinitely, he had more than enough time to grow his business. He had narrowed it down to selling chapati, a kind of fried dough that is loved by many in the East African region. He would also be selling fish, which he intended to catch by himself. Once the schools resume, Mugabe was going to use the proceeds of his business to buy himself school supplies and lessen the financial burden on his parents. He was a man with a plan. On the sunny Sunday of November 17, 2021, Mugabe woke up early to prepare his dough, which he was going to use later on to cook chapatis. While the dough was resting, he grabbed his paddle and went out to Lake Kijanabarola. Accompanying him was his friend, Cougar. On their way there, being the teenage boys that they were, they played together their entire way to the lake. They plucked the straws of the grass on their path, picked up fallen sticks and fiddled with them. They also picked up pebbles, and when the path was clear, they'd challenge each other to see who could throw them the farthest. They burst into giggles as they made fun of each other. They finally arrived at the lake. It was peaceful and statue still, save for the chirping birds and rustling of the leaves. It was dead silent. As was their norm, they exchanged pleasantries with the residents before proceeding to the shore of the lake, where they helped each other into the canoe, careful not to topple over. They paddled the boat slowly through the lake as they got their nets and baits ready. They cast their net and caught a few fish, but it was still not enough, as some of the fish were far too small for his customers. Mugabe would throw the small fish back in the water, cast his net into the water again, and hope for bigger fish. Minutes later, he would be grinning in excitement after catching his preferred size of fish. Things were looking up, and in his mind, he was already calculating his profits per fish. He graded them and separated those that he was going to sell fresh from those he was going to fry. Unbeknown to them was a mother hippo in the water that was not pleased with their sudden presence in the cool, calm waters. Hippos spend the majority of their day in water, hiding from the blistering African sun, and they can hold their breath underwater for more than 5 minutes, so it's easy for them to go unnoticed. The paddle cutting through the water, the net spreading across the water's surface and submerging into the water, and the burst of excitement that the boys let out when they caught the fish were a nuisance to this particular hippo. She also had her newborn with her, and anything going too close to them was perceived as a threat. She was already worked up from the noise and couldn't take it anymore, since the waters were muddy from the soils that kept sliding to the bottom of the lake. The pair were unaware that they had drifted into hippo territory. The angry mother hippo was determined to put an end to the noise and restore peace for her and her newborn. Despite being extremely hubby creatures, hippos are able to glide through the water noiselessly. Their nose, ears, and eyes are located on top of their head, so they are able to see and breathe while underwater. She moved silently and fast until she was right beneath the canoe of the boys. Unaware of the looming danger, the boys continued to talk about everything they possibly could. Their plan was to get the fish and leave the lake so that they can have enough time to prepare the chapatis and fish that they were going to sell during the lunch hour. Little did they know that they'd never make it out of the murky waters of Lake Kijanabarola. The angry mother hippo emerged slightly from the water and opened its mouth wide, exposing its 3-inch canines. The hippo's teeth came crashing on the canoe and capsized it. The boys, who were caught by surprise, landed in the muddy water, but they were unable to swim to the shore. There was splashing of the water as their arms flailed and their legs kicked, and then there was dead silence. Not a sound in the water. It was as if time had stood still. The residents who had heard commotion raced to the lake, only to see the head of the hippo slowly go underwater. They waited for the boys to resurface, but they didn't. The residents of Lake Kijanabarola knew too well that this was the teenagers' last day under the sun. For a long period of time, the hippos at this lake had been a nuisance to them and had claimed the lives of their fellow fishermen. They were a threat to their fishing activities, as the hippos would often interrupt them with a sudden attack, seemingly out of nowhere. To worsen matters, the hippos had caused them a significant food shortage, as they'd often invade their gardens and plantation and ravage their crops. They'd eat their vegetables right before harvest and step on the seedlings that had just sprouted from the ground. Efforts to drive them away had been deemed futile, and the villagers were at a loss. As nightfall came, Mugabe's uncle grew worried after he had not returned home. He was a disciplined boy who always kept track of time. So when he didn't show up at the house, his uncle put on his coat and went out looking for him. When he got to his stall, the chapati dough he had made earlier in the day remained untouched. On inquiring among the traders, he was informed that Mugabe had not returned from the lake. His uncle then retraced his steps he took to the lake. He talked to the residents and asked them if they had seen Mugabe that day. Sadly, Mugabe's description matched one of the boys. The residents informed him that 2 boys had drowned in the lake after a hippo attacked their canoe. A few brave fishermen had gone into the water after the authorities were notified of the incident, but they were unable to retrieve any of the bodies. It was now up to Mugabe's uncle to break the news to Mugabe's father. He called him, and as he waited for him to pick up, his mind raced with the right words to use to tell him what had happened. When Mugabe's father saw his brother's call, his heart was filled with joy. He picked up, and after they exchanged their usual pleasantries, he was expecting to talk to his son so that he could update him on the progress of his business. Unfortunately, this was never to be, as his brother informed him that his son was no more. Mugabe's father couldn't understand how that was possible, and everything else that he was told after that was reduced to murmurs as a deep sadness engulfed his heart. He was devastated that his son's effort in the business were all for nothing. The news had now spread across villages of another hippo attack, and they finally made it to Kagwa's family, who went to the lake, hoping to retrieve their son's body. On Monday morning, Kagwa's father requested for a day off and took the next bus to Karunda Malika, where he was embraced by his brother. Together with Kagwa's family, the 2 grief-stricken families sat by the shore of the lake, waiting for the bodies to be retrieved by authorities and the local fishermen. A gloomy cloud rested above them. The fishermen went into the water, careful not to agitate the hippos, and for the second day they came up empty. The families of the teenagers dragged their feet as they left for their homes. Thankfully, on Tuesday, 2 days after the attack, the bodies were retrieved from the murky lake, and their families could finally give them a proper burial. The boys both had deep puncture wounds all over their bodies, as if the hippo had chewed on their bodies without eating them. Some of the puncture wounds from the hippo's teeth were directly through the boys' vital organs, including their lungs and heart. It was clear that the boys didn't stand much of a chance. To date, hippos remain responsible for at least 500 deaths a year in Africa and are considered to be the deadliest land animal on the planet. If you ever find yourself near a hippo, get out of there fast. They are known to be extremely aggressive. Once they launch an attack, they don't give up until someone meets their terrifying final affliction. Nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Range, 30 miles east of Seattle, lies North Bend. It is a residential community surrounded by woodland and mountains. Locals and visitors can enjoy hiking, fishing, climbing, river sports, wildlife, and mountain biking within the city limits. This is exactly where 32-year-old S.J. Brooks headed on Saturday, May 19, 2018. He and his 31-year-old friend, Isaac Saterbaum, went for a bike ride through the woodland. They followed one of the popular trails. It wound around the trees, often wide enough for the 2 of them to ride side by side, talking as they went. But the 2 of them weren't alone. There was a cougar nearby, but this wasn't just any cougar. It was an exceptionally dangerous one. A young male, emaciated and starving. It was looking for an easy meal. It may have been suffering from disease, poisoning, or an injury, but it had reverted to desperate measures. out during daylight hours and in territory it was not familiar with. It considered the two young men as potential prey. In the mid-morning light, the cougar could hear the two men coming closer. They were enjoying the outdoors. S.J. was an avid biker. He had worked as a bike mechanic in the past, and his love for the sport led him to co-found a bike community called Friends on Bikes, Seattle. This was where people of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds came together to enjoy the outdoors on bikes. It brought those from minorities such as trans, femme, non-binary people of color together and was something he was proud of. When they reached a corner in the track, the two of them heard a rustle in the bushes and looked behind them. There, amongst the undergrowth, was a beige-brown cougar. He had been watching them intently as they came within striking distance, and then he launched his attack as they cycled past. He was hot on their heels, chasing them through the woods. As tempting as it was to try and outpace the cougar, the two men knew better. Instinct was telling them to make a break for it, but their heads and the knowledge they had of these wild cats told them to stay still. They squeezed the brakes and jumped off their bikes, turning around to face the approaching cat. Cougars are generalist hypercarnivores, feeding on a range of large mammals including mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, mountain goats, and bighorn sheep. They also opportunistically take smaller animals such as rodents, rabbits, and birds. Although they are capable of sprinting, these cats typically ambush their prey. They stalk their prey from behind. The cougar you don't see is the one that is hunting you. They will then leap onto their prey from behind and deliver a fatal bite to the back of the neck. The cougar's eyes were large and brown, reflecting the mid-morning sun. The shoulder blade protruded through the skin as it half stalked, half ran at the two men. They stood with their bikes standing between them and the cougar. It came closer. They made noise, typically something that will scare away the usually timid cats, but it didn't work. Their shouting had no effect on the hungry predator. It continued to advance. When it was within feet of them, Isaac swung his bike around to hit the cougar. The back wheel made contact with the cat and it backed away. The two men watched as the cougar began to slope off. They breathed heavily, both letting out sighs of relief, looking at each other and beginning to talk about how crazy that encounter had been. But just as they let their guard down, the cougar came back for more. It was bold and determined. It rushed at them and leapt onto Isaac. He was floored. The huge cat had his head in its jaws and began to crush his skull. It then began to shake him violently. He felt like his neck might snap. S.J. hit the cat, but it didn't release his friend. Isaac wrestled back. He was desperately trying to pry open the cougar's jaws, trying to pull his head free. He refused to give up. The powerful animal stood over him, whilst he grappled with its face, kicking with his legs and gritting his teeth as he fought for his life. S.J. knew he needed to get help and began to run away. But when he began to flee, the cougar noticed out of the corner of its eye. It looked up and released Isaac. He pulled his head out of its jaws. The cat's attention turned to S.J. Its killer instinct kicked in as it saw its prey running away from the scene. It immediately ran after him, pouncing on him at the last second and securing him in its jaws. It then began dragging the man kicking and screaming into the undergrowth. It was now time for Isaac to get help. He pulled out his mobile phone, but there was no reception. He jumped onto his bike and sped back down the track he had cycled only moments before. He held his phone out in front of him, praying for the signal bars to appear on the screen, but they didn't, and his heart thumped loudly in his chest as he tore along the path. He needed S.J. to hold on. He was getting help, but his friend needed to hold on just a bit longer. He himself was in bad shape, blood pouring down his face from the gashes on his head. He was battered and bruised, panicked, and in shock, but he plowed on. It wasn't until 2 miles later that his phone finally pinged with reception. He screeched to a halt and dialed 911. His desperate call cut out after just a few seconds, but he called them back. When he was on the phone, making a desperate plea to the 911 dispatcher, a passerby offered to help. He handed them the phone, and they described the state Isaac was in, conscious but with serious lacerations to his face and head. Emergency services were dispatched and rushed to the scene. He directed them up the trail to where he had last seen S.J. Isaac was also suffering from severe injuries and was flown to Harborview Medical Center and treated for his wounds. All the while, he was hoping and praying that his friend had made it. It took the rescue team 30 minutes to get to the place of the attack. They found the cougar. It was standing in woodlands just off the main trail in what looked like its den. They could see its beige body, long but thin, its ribs visible under its skin. It turned to look at them. They noticed that it was standing astride a body that was partially covered in undergrowth. It was an attempt by the cougar to conceal its prey from other predators in the area. When the cougar saw the authorities approaching, it scarpered, leaving behind SJ's body. Emergency services assessed SJ, but it was clear he could not be revived. He had succumbed to his terrible injuries. Agents from the Washington Department of Fish and Game spent hours tracking down the cougar. Eventually, at 4 p.m., they had managed to follow its trail. It led them through the rugged woodland, where they found it huddled up a tree, staring down at them. The rarity of the attack and the way in which it pursued the two men, despite doing everything they should have done, made this cougar exceptionally dangerous. For whatever reason, it was unpredictable and likely to strike again. The decision was made to shoot it. It came crashing down to the ground where it could be examined by experts. It was a young male, 3 or 4 years old, but it was severely underweight. For its size, it should have weighed around 140 pounds, just over 60 kilograms, but instead it weighed just 100 pounds, 45 kilograms. It was sent off for a necropsy at the veterinary lab at Washington State University. SJ and Isaac were incredibly unlucky. The two of them had acted exactly as they should have done. They resisted the urge to try and race away from the cougar, and instead stopped their bikes and faced it. They made loud noises and stood together, standing tall and not backing down. Usually these things are enough to scare off cougars. They are renowned for being incredibly timid, and it is rare that people see them, as they often slink away at the first sign of people. This just goes to show how desperate this cougar must have been. In a state with around 2,000 cougars, SJ was only the second victim of a fatal attack in Washington in 94 years. But encounters with cougars are becoming more common. This is largely due to 2 reasons. Firstly, their numbers are making a significant comeback from the bounty hunting years during the last century. And secondly, people are encroaching more and more on their habitat. Territories are cut in half by roads, woodlands are demolished to make way for ranches, and towns and cities are forever expanding into the surrounding countryside. It is no wonder that cougars are struggling to find food and remain concealed from the human population. Experts recommend the following if you do find yourself face to face with a cougar. Immediately pick up small children, stop, speak firmly, and slowly back away. Do not make sudden movements or run, as these might trigger its innate prey drive. Try to appear as big as possible by raising your hands, standing on a tree stump, or opening your jacket. Keep your eyes on the animal and become more assertive if it doesn't back off. And if it does attack, fight back, or you might just end up meeting your terrifying final affliction. This story just goes to show that animal attacks can happen to even the most experienced and cautious hikers and campers. The tragedy occurred in September 2023 and shook the residents of the province of Alberta. Doug Inglis, aged 62, and Jenny Gussie, also 62, had been together since university. They lived in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. They were inseparable, both working as technicians in the same scientific lab. They had a deep love for the great outdoors and were certainly no stranger to the challenges that it can sometimes present. They each carried with them vital survival kits and emergency equipment every time they ventured into the wilderness. They traveled out to Banff National Park twice a year, usually once in the spring and once in the fall. But the national park is home to some of the deadliest predators in Canada, grizzly bears. There are thought to be 65 individuals that call Banff home, with a further 20 to 40 black bears too. A family member said that Doug and Jenny were very careful people when they were on their adventures in the wilderness, whether it be hiking, camping, canoeing, or whitewater rafting. They knew bear protocol, and they followed it to a T. But sometimes, with even the best precautions in place, people can find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pair had with them their sidekick and hiking companion, their dog. The three of them stuck to signposted routes and always adhered to any warnings displayed throughout the park. But on that fateful trip in late September 2023, there were no warnings. No bears had been sighted in that area, and there had been no reports of them from visitors. They were on day 5 of a week-long visit to the park, something they looked forward to every year. They were making their way along Red Deer River Valley, west of Yahatinda Ranch. This valley is an untouched landscape within the park. It is inaccessible to most hikers, with no roads leading in or out of it. Meadows give way to mature spruce forests, and towering above the valley floor are craggy mountaintops and glacial cirques. The area is home to some fascinating wildlife, including elk, moose, wolves, grizzly bears, and cougars. The landscape is simply stunning, but its remoteness isn't for the faint of heart, and it has its dangers. After the 5th day's hiking, the couple found a spot to camp for the night. They hadn't made it to the planned camping spot, but wanted to set up before it got dark. They knew bears posed a real threat and didn't want to run into one as the sun set. It was a sensible decision. They had time to set up their tent and cook dinner before night fell. As the three of them settled around the campfire, Doug sent a notification message using their Garmin InReach to his uncle, Colin Inglis. The message said they hadn't made the planned campsite, but were setting up camp now. The message pinged through at 5 p.m. It was the reassurance their family needed, and it was yet another safety precaution the cautious couple took whilst hiking in the backcountry. They checked in with family twice every day, but what the couple didn't know was that there was a grizzly bear on the prowl that evening. As the weather begins to get colder, bears enter a hyperphagic state in which they gorge themselves on as much food as possible before the winter. It's essential for them to pack in the calories and pack on the pounds. They need to make it through the long, cold, dark winter months, all the way through to springtime. Something alerted the bear to their presence. Perhaps it was their scent, the smell of their dinner, or the clinking of pots and pans as they cleared away their dinner. Whatever happened, their bear came for them. The couple, being experienced campers and bear-wise, had hung up their food in a nearby tree so as not to attract bears into their tent. They also kept with them a can of bear spray each. After dinner, Doug and Jenny crawled into their tent with their dog. As night fell and darkness engulfed Banff National Park, the two of them sat up reading on their e-readers, something they did every night before settling down. But outside, a grizzly bear was approaching the tent. They could hear it sniffing just the other side of the canvas. They stayed still and as quiet as possible, hardly daring to breathe. Then, terrifyingly, it slashed through the canvas and tried to grab the couple inside. The dog growled and barked, and Doug and Jenny tried to scare it away, yelling at it. Doug reached for his bear spray and emptied the canister at the bear. But in a fury, the bear fought back. Nobody knows exactly what happened during those horrifying moments, but one of them sent an SOS message from the Garmin, which Doug's uncle received. It said, "Bear attack, bad."
So last Monday, they started out. And Monday night, like every other time, at the end of the day, I would get an inReach message saying, we're at our destination, everything's okay. On Friday night, same thing. At 4:52, I got a message saying we're delayed, but everything's okay. And that message would mean that they were in a camp, their camp was set up, they were probably making dinner, and they were messaging myself and Jenny's mom with that message to say that things were good. 8:15, the phone rings. I got a phone call from Garmin, who inReach belongs to, and the message was, we've had an SOS message, and the SOS, not only was the SOS activated, which is a button, but there was a message input into the inReach that said, bear attack bad. So at that point, we knew something was happening that was very bad, that they were in trouble.
The distress message also immediately alerted a wildlife human attack response team. This emergency GPS device was yet another piece of equipment the well-prepared couple always carried with them. It was potentially a life-saving device. The response team were deployed immediately, but the use of a chopper was out of the question due to poor weather and poor visibility. This was a serious blow. The rescue team knew that after a bear attack, every second counts, and now they were forced to make the journey on foot. They were specially trained individuals with mountaineering and medical training, specifically to attend to animal attack victims. Marching through the Canadian wilderness, they didn't know what they were going to find at the location. Nobody knew if the victims were dead or alive. They had to traverse the steep, rocky terrain in the dead of night, their flashlights illuminating the way. They knew they were walking into danger. They knew that a bear was out there, and yet they had to keep going to try and reach the couple in desperate need. At 1 o'clock in the morning, 5 hours after they received the distress signal, the rescuers arrived at the couple's camp. The scene they arrived at was distressing. They could see signs of a struggle and, tragically, they could see 3 dead bodies, those of Doug and Jenny and that of their dog. The grizzly bear had rampaged through the camp, destroying everyone in it. The 3 of them lay on the ground outside the tent. As they scouted around the campsite, they tried to piece together what had happened. The food was still hung up in the trees, and lying on the ground were 2 cans of bear spray. They were empty. The tent was flattened and shredded. The 2 e-readers were inside with their screens smashed. There were signs of a struggle that didn't occur in just one place. There was evidence that the couple tried to scare the bear away, but none of their preparation and none of their scare tactics worked. But the rescue team wasn't alone. They were being watched by the same grizzly. It stood just yards away, hidden by the trees. As they investigated the scene, they suddenly heard a crashing through the undergrowth. Turning their heads and spinning their flashlights around, they saw a grizzly bear emerging from the trees, illuminated by their flashlight beams. It ran into the clearing. It wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a mock charge. They only had one option. Pulling the trigger on a rifle, one of the rescue team shot the bear. It fell to the ground just feet from where they stood. Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the scene at 5 o'clock that morning. They carefully carried the victims away and sent the bear off for a necropsy. The investigation into the bear revealed that she was a 25-year-old female. She wasn't lactating at the time and wasn't tagged or known to the park rangers as a nuisance bear. She was in fairly good condition but with poor teeth and less than normal body fat for that time of year. Her behavior had been very aggressive. If a bear has attacked a person due to defense from being startled, then it usually leaves the area afterwards. But this bear remained nearby. Could this bear have been hunting the 2 hikers? Was this a predatory attack? Attacks by bears in Canada are rare, and predatory attacks exceedingly rare. With just 65 grizzlies in the park, the last known fatal attack occurred in 1973, when a heavily sedated bear charged at a biologist as it was being relocated and released. Of course, this tragedy has hit Doug and Jenny's family and friends hard. It is difficult to comprehend exactly what has happened and the sequence of events that led up to their deaths. Those who knew the couple are in a state of shock, and for it to have happened to such an experienced couple means that it can happen to anyone. Even after deploying 2 cans of bear spray onto the bear, it wasn't enough to stop the couple's terrifying final affliction. 25-year-old Cameron Bays was from New Zealand's North Shore, a region incorporating the largest city, Auckland. He was a keen surfer, so when he married the love of his life, Tina Marie, he took his surfboard with them on their honeymoon. The young couple headed to Australia's west coast of South Australia. They planned to travel around the country for 6 months. After a few days spent relaxing on the beaches and surfing, the couple then planned to head to Western Australia to do some shearing. On September 23, 2000, Cameron and Tina Marie set up camp at Cactus Beach Campground, situated 14 miles from the town of Penang. The beach was a magnificent place to watch the surfers riding the waves. Sat on top of the dunes, campers would watch the spectacle even as dusk set in. But Cameron wasn't there to watch the surfers. He was there to hit the waves himself. The following morning, at first light, Cameron unzipped the tent and headed out for a surf. He said goodbye to his wife and walked the short distance from the campsite to the beach. It was 6:15 in the morning, and as he paddled out to sea, he was the only one out there. It was a magical spot, looking back at the golden sands bordered by the rocky cliffs. The rising sun's warm glow reflected off the ocean as Cameron bobbed up and down on his board. But there was a marine predator swimming towards him that he couldn't see and didn't know about. It was a great white shark around 5 meters, 16 feet long. As always, the opportunistic hunter was on the search for potential prey when it spotted the shadow of Cameron at the surface. The waves were breaking about 50 meters offshore. Dry land wasn't far away. Also up early that morning was 44-year-old father Jeff Lincoln from Port Lincoln. He was on a camping trip with his 2 children. They sat on the dunes watching Cameron surfing the waves as the sun came up. But the serenity of the scene was about to change dramatically, something that neither witness would ever forget. Suddenly, Cameron felt something knock into his board. The force of the hit sent him flying into the water. The great white had struck him from underneath without warning and without fear. Cameron was shocked at first, and then the adrenaline began kicking in. He saw the enormous jaws of the shark as it came at him. He lashed out with his fists, trying to push the shark away, trying to punch it on the snout. He reached around for his board and managed to pull himself on top of it. Then he turned and paddled furiously for the shore. It looked for a split second that he might make it and get away from the shark, but the predator came back for more. From the shore, Jeff and his children could see the attack unfolding. Just as Cameron had managed to paddle a few feet away from the shark, it grabbed his leg and pulled him off his board once more. It now had him held firmly in its jaws and thrashed its body from side to side as it drove Cameron around and around in a circle. Those watching on in horror could see the commotion in the water and knew something was wrong. Then they saw the dark gray body of the shark arch up and out of the water, and the surfer being thrown around like a rag doll. Camping ground owner Ron Gates immediately called the emergency services, while some of the other campers rushed to the beach. One of those campers to witness the horrific attack was Peter Ryan, a 43-year-old from Moana Beach. He said the shark created a whirlpool which dragged Cameron down. Then a wave crashed over them. There was a flash of red in the water, and then nothing. Peter caught the last 30 seconds of the 90-second attack and said that it seemed to last forever. Looking out over the water in absolute horror, there was nothing anybody could do except witness the gruesome and heart-wrenching attack. A few pieces of Cameron's mangled board were picked up by searchers who scoured the ocean for any sign of the young man's body. When the news reached his wife, Tina Marie, she was taken to Seduna Hospital in a state of severe shock. What was supposed to be the happiest time of their lives ended in tragedy. No trace of Cameron was ever found, and it is thought that he was almost entirely consumed by the shark. He was the second person that year to be attacked by a shark at Cactus Beach. Early in February, Anthony Hayes was grabbed by a great white, but only managed to break free when his best friend rushed over and punched the shark in the eye repeatedly. He was lucky to survive, and when he heard about the loss of Cameron, it brought home to him just how lucky he had been. But for another young surfer, his luck was about to run out just 36 hours after Cameron was taken at Cactus Beach. This time it was 17-year-old Javon Wright who took to the water. He regularly surfed at Elliston, situated 200 miles south of Cactus Beach, still in the Great Australian Bight. Javon and his friends jumped into the water near Black's Reef. Black's is a notoriously heavy wave that surfers brave every day. It is said to be haunted, not only from various tragedies that have befallen swimmers and surfers in the shark-infested waters, but from a massacre that occurred in 1849 between Europeans and Aborigines. The violent nature of the wave is said to be fueled by the anger of these souls who perished during the massacre. Joining Javon and his friends on their surf that day was Javon's girlfriend's father. They had spent the late morning surfing and, as afternoon approached, decided to call it a day. It was just before 1 p.m. when Javon headed for the shore. He paddled away from the surf along with his friends, ready to grab some food and meet up with his girlfriend. But something would put an end to those plans. It was enormous, every surfer's worst nightmare. A great white, measuring 18 to 20 feet long, 5 to 6 meters, soared up through the water column. It made a beeline directly for Javon. When the youngster was just 30 meters from reaching the jagged shoreline, the shark struck. Javon was sent flying into the air. The impact was immense, and Javon didn't have time to scream or cry out. His friends turned and saw the enormous shark right next to them. As Javon crashed back down into the water, probably disoriented from the hit and unaware of what just happened, the shark struck again. One of Javon's friends watched in horror as the mammoth predator grabbed hold of Javon and disappeared beneath the turbulent surface. That was it. There was no sign of Javon ever again. He had been consumed by the shark in a matter of seconds. Just 2 strikes, and he was gone. There was no long, drawn-out struggle, and no chance of his friends rescuing him. The attack had been too rapid for anyone, let alone Javon, to respond. Those who had been just feet from him when the incident happened and who had just spent a great time surfing with him were left shocked, stunned, and horrified by what happened. One of the fellow surfers swam into the water to retrieve Javon's board. Only the top third remained. The rest had been taken by the shark along with Javon. Having 2 lethal shark attacks happen just 36 hours apart, and both within the same stretch of coastline, led some to speculate whether there was a man-eater on the prowl. But shark experts were quick to point out that it was unlikely for the same shark to travel 200 miles after killing the first victim. Although great whites can travel great distances in a single day, it appeared that these 2 attacks were coincidence. The nature of the 2 attacks are considered extremely rare. Although fatalities do happen from shark attacks, they are typically from the first initial bite. This is a test bite that the shark does to see if a human is worthy prey or not. More than 80% of the shark attacks are hit-and-run style attacks with a bite and release. However, due to the damage of a single bite, many people bleed out from that test bite. It is rare for a shark to continue to attack a person and eat them. They typically recognize humans as a biological failure, as we take more energy than we give, so we are not a prey item. That said, with the rise in water sports and water activities, there are bound to be more human-shark interactions, and whether a shark perceives us as prey or not, it only takes 1 bite before you meet your terrifying final affliction.